Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we've been following the story of energy usage, energy supply, energy reliability very closely since our inception in May of this year. And that continues today with an astonishing report, frankly, that came out from the Institute of Public Affairs and their senior research fellow Kevin Yu, which found that if we were to actually achieve net zero by 2050, we would have to cover 1/3 of Australia's prime agricultural land in windmills and solar panels. It sounds absurd. It sounds ridiculous. Is it really true? Because if it is, surely this is the end of the argument. So I brought the man himself, Kevin Yu, Senior Research Fellow from the Institute of Public Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's an extraordinary thing. I'm just going to put this is the cover from, this is on the IPA's website right now. 1/3 of prime agricultural land would have to be sacrificed for the net zero pipe dream. That can't be true. Surely this is just clickbait.
Well, what we've done, the research that we've done so far is we looked at the government's commitment to Australia becoming a what's termed renewable energy superpower. So that's essentially what that means is transitioning away from our comparative advantage in energy production through hydrocarbon to producing energy by way of wind and solar farms. And what we've done is to calculate the amount of Australian land that will be required to generate energy needed for Australia to become a renewable energy superpower. So for domestic consumption as well as exports. So that's what it means for us to become a zero superpower. So that's essentially buying into this race to the bottom to become a zero superpower. And the implication is massive. It's absolutely massive. 120 million hectares worth of land will have to be sacrificed, which will be the equivalent to 15% of Australia's land mass, a third of agricultural land, which is equivalent to the area larger than the entire state of South Australia.
Sorry, 15% of the entire land mass would have to be then covered in solar panels or have wind farms sited on them. All right, a couple of questions here. The existing wind farms have been sited in places where they believe they're ideal. That's obviously why they've been put into those places. But there are a limited number of ideal sites for wind farms. Have you factored in the reduced efficiency, the reduced capacity factor that would occur if we began to proliferate wind farms into less ideal locations? Or are you actually potentially tipping the scales against yourself by allowing for the existing level of efficiency?
Well, the thing about it is, with renewable energy with renewable energy infrastructure, there are a number of factors that will need to be weighed in order to determine the most suitable location for the infrastructure. It's not the case that a project proponent would look at a piece of land and say, "Oh, there's no farmland there. No one's using it. We'll take that. We'll cover that in solar panels. There's no one using that bit of land. We'll cover that in solar panels." That's not how it works. The location of wind farms and solar farms is dictated by labor availabilities, the availability of access to infrastructure, to supplies, as well as a number of other things, including native title rules and regulations. And so all of those factors combined means that there is a direct competition between land used for agriculture and land used for wind and solar energy production.
Well, I can tell you, I see that with my own eyes where I live now, out in the Murray-Darling Basin. You don't have to drive very far before you find yourself looking at beautiful paddocks that used to have cows or used to have crops in them that are now covered in solar panels. We're certainly watching that unfold. Now, it gets actually worse. I read further and deeper into your report, and it's quite an extraordinary thing here. You're obviously forecasting, or you're taking into account the forecast increase in Australian energy consumption and that of our trading partners that we supply energy to, which is a good point. We are an energy exporter. And isn't there a bit of a lie at the heart of the renewables argument where they say that our percentage of renewable supply is increasing and therefore we're getting closer to net zero? But isn't it true that at the same time our outright usage of hydrocarbons is also actually increasing?
Absolutely, and that's a misrepresentation of the facts. the demand is there, and the truth of the matter is that wind and solar, because of the much lower efficiency of wind and solar, they can't replace. That's simply the fact. They can't replace traditional hydrocarbon fuel, and so there's a greater and greater reliance as a result of increased economic output, increased economic growth of our trading partners and in various parts of the world, and the increasing population in places like India and including Australia as a result of migration, that the demand is there and wind and solar simply can't catch up. And so, what does that mean? We will need more and more hydrocarbon fuels in order to meet the demand.
It's an extraordinary thing. Now, I wanted to try and wrap my mind around the implications of this 15% of Australia's landmass. I mean, you said it there. The entire state of South Australia would have to be under either solar or wind. And then, of course, that doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but that doesn't include all of the other transmission infrastructure that would be required, the transformers that would be required, and not to mention the storage that would be required, because even with that amount of area, I mean, it's just extraordinary. So I wanted to wrap my head around it, and I jumped onto the Australian website here. This is the Australian Government Land Use and Management survey that was done. This is from back in 2015-16. As best as I can tell, this is their latest one. It breaks down the entire country, 100% of the landmass, into these categories that you see on the screen there. The relevant categories that really caught my eye by way of comparison with this: urban intensive uses and rural residential. Now, between those two, we've covered the land on which every single Australian lives. Your house block in town and the house, the residential area within farms. Every single Australian's dwelling is covered in those two categories. And if you look at the very right-hand column, we're looking at a combined total of, what's that, 0.62 of 1%. Not even 3/4 of 1%. And yet you're talking about 15%. Where are we going to get these resources from? This seems like it's not even feasible.
Well, the resources that we're going to need to import into Australia will predominantly come from China, and the effect is that it's going to push us closer and closer to our most threatening regional adversary, because most of the solar panels and wind turbines that we're going to need in order to fulfill this net zero pipe dream will necessarily have to be manufactured in China. And the other side of the coin is that it will rip us further and further apart from our traditional allies in the region, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India, because what we're doing with our net zero pathway is to jeopardize their energy security, jeopardize their regional security, as well as our own.
It's an extraordinary thing to think that there are people, grown adults out there, who with a straight face are saying that we're going to save the planet by having a foreign country that does not have nearly as strict environmental controls on their own resource extraction and processing, etc., dig up billions of tons of earth to then refine and extract raw materials to then ship a quarter of the way across the planet to get to Australia to cover 15% of our landmass in man-made infrastructure, and that's how we're going to save the planet? How does anyone in government, in policy, put this down in a document and take it serious? Do they know what they're saying?
Well, the fact of the matter is that parts of the advocacy groups that are advocating for this net zero pipe dream, they've been relatively transparent about it. Not a full transparency, but they acknowledge that there will be environmental destruction, that we will need to turn our lives upside down. Take a look at Net Zero Australia's mobilisation report, for example. Our children will need to be indoctrinated in this religious faith of net zero. Our farmers may need to be kicked off the farms. They acknowledge all of that. They acknowledge the monstrosity of it all. They acknowledge the environmental destruction, the fact that it's going to cost up to $9 trillion by 2060, $5 trillion by 2050. It's all out there in public, and they've been relatively transparent about what it would all cost.
It's extraordinary to think that even with all of that, there are people who still believe that this is feasible, much less desirable. Well, Kevin Yu, Senior Research Fellow from the Institute of Public Affairs, thank you so much for the report that you put out. Thank you so much for bringing yourself and bringing that information to us here on the Aussie Wire. This is quite an extraordinary thing. To actually see it so starkly is quite remarkable. And I can only hope that we start to see a bit of common sense creep into this debate sometime soon. Kevin Yu, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.